Really honored to moderate today's discussion featuring leaders who bring firsthand experience, policy expertise, and deep regional knowledge to this issue. We're joined today by two of my colleagues from the Kennedy School. We have Freddy Guevara, Ash Center Democracy Visiting Fellow and Venezuelan opposition leader, whose personal experience with political persecution offers an essential perspective on the realities facing democratic actors in Venezuela. We also have Ricardo Hausmann. He's the Rafik Hariri Professor of the Practice of International Political Economy and Director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Growth Lab. Ricardo, of course, brings deep expertise on economic development and regional political economy. In addition to my two HKS colleagues, we're also joined by two former colleagues of mine from government, Rebecca Bill Chavez, the president and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs, who adds a critical lens on U.S. policy and hemispheric security. And finally, we have Juan Gonzalez. He is resident fellow at the Georgetown Americas Institute and former senior director for the Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council, who can offer insight into diplomacy, regional strategy, and U.S.-Latin America relations. I'm really grateful to each of our panelists for being here, and I look forward to a thoughtful and timely discussion. In terms of what you're going to hear today, I'll start with a few questions of my own for the panelists before then turning to audience Q&A. And in this context, I'll ask the audience to pose questions in the chat box using the Q&A function. You'll see a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to start sharing your questions as the conversation begins and as it proceeds. And after about 30 or 35 minutes, we'll turn to those audience questions in the Q&A box. I just want to remind everyone that this conversation is being recorded for YouTube, and it is being live streamed and available to the public. I'd ask the questioners, if they feel comfortable, to identify themselves when drafting their questions, stating their Harvard affiliation and their year. But I would also note that they're welcome to submit their questions anonymously, should they prefer to do so. And we'll turn to audience questions as the conversation proceeds. But first, I want to start with a few questions of my own. And I do want to start with those for whom this is especially personal. And as I mentioned, we're joined by two Venezuelans today, Freddy and Ricardo. So Freddy, let me start with you. You, of course, suffered immensely under the Maduro regime. Many people have probably read the recent Boston Globe write-up of your experience. We'll get into the politics and geopolitics in just a bit. But I want to ask what this moment means to you personally, and whether you're optimistic for Venezuela's future, and more broadly, how Venezuelans are responding to this moment and what may be contradictory instincts. We have the ouster of this dictator through the intervention of a foreign power, Uncle Sam in this case, but also it seems the retention of his broader regime. So over to you to try and unpack some of that.
Oh, thank you very much, Ned, and thanks everyone. So as a Venezuelan, I want to first, of course, be thankful for this opportunity to raise our voices, but I also want to begin acknowledging something important, that I understand that many Americans and many other international people that might be watching can have serious concerns or critiques of what happened or how it happened and what can it mean for each of your countries. I believe that every democratic society has the right to scrutinize power, to debate legality, to question your government. And quite frankly, I'm envious of that, because that's what we want in our country. We want to be able to criticize our government without being put in prison. But at the same time, I want to ask for empathy for Venezuelans. You know, for us, this is not a discussion about legal frameworks or institutions or theoretical frameworks. This is about real lives, torture, imprisonment, exile, families broken apart, a country held hostage for more than 25 years. And it's a country in which we tried elections, we tried negotiations, we tried international mediation, we went to the United Nations, but always China and Russia vetoing. We tried the International Criminal Court, but sadly nothing happened there. We tried the Organization of American States, nothing happened. And we even tried the mediation of progressive governments like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and Lula in Brazil, and nothing worked. So time after time, all of this came into the same conclusion. I am not an American. I won't comment on US internal politics, but I will try to explain how Venezuelans are seeing this moment. And, I know that this might be contradictory for many people, but the truth is very simple. Venezuelans are happy and relieved that Nicolás Maduro is no longer free and it's in a prison. And this was not the outcome that we dream of. We wanted a democratic transition. We wanted justice through institutions. We tried everything, but they built this path for themselves. This wasn't us. It wasn't even the Americans. This was kind of a self-made prophecy that started with Chavez and then with Maduro. And I hope that it will end also with this regime that is now. So what matters now is the crucial distinctions. I think that you can debate everything, but that is very different from defending or calling for the release of a criminal dictator as Nicolás Maduro. You can oppose your administration, but that cannot mean, it doesn't mean that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And this is what I want to be very clear. I'm not asking anyone to agree with how this happened, but I'm asking you to not abandon Venezuelans now that this happened, because it is the biggest opportunity we have in a long time, and there are risks still. I am optimistic. I believe that we can achieve a free and fair election and a democratic transition. I believe so, but we need the support of everyone because this is not an easy task. This regime has been deeply penetrated by foreign authoritarian actors like Cuba, Russia, Iran, China, and we need all the support that is required. We, of course, want a future in which Venezuelans choose our leaders through free and fair elections and that our resources serves our people. But the reality now is that all of this discussion of oil has been missing one important point. And for the last years, none of the oil have been serving the Venezuelan people. Quite contrary, has been used to buy weapons, corruption, and loyalties that allow us to be in jail. One final reflection that is very important about more like the international order. And I believe in rule of law, of course, and I believe in that things should be different. But if the international order didn't protect me and millions of Venezuelans and hundreds of Venezuelans that were imprisoned and tortured, but it's an international order that's being used to try to defend a brutal dictator, then it's not just that it's not working, it's working against us. And I'm using the words of a Venezuelan who was also imprisoned, and that he reflects what all of we are saying. So my ask is simple. Please do not turn Venezuela into a partisan battleship. Do not defend a dictatorship in the name of opposing someone, and help ensure that this moment leads not to stability without freedom. We don't want a Saudi Arabia or a China in Latin America. What we want is a democratic transition that Venezuelans have fought for decades, and that will require all the support from all the American society, but also the free world. Thank you.
Freddy, thank you. I want to pick up on what you said about wanting freedom, wanting free and fair elections and a democracy to follow. Ricardo, you wrote this week in The Economist, and I thought it was a very powerful piece, quote, "Prosperity does not come from oil, decrees, or even benevolent rulers. It comes from rights. Rights create property, rights create security, rights create debate, rights allow people to invest, to innovate, to dream, and to transform reality. Take rights away and society withers, restore them, and recovery is possible." So let me ask you, Ricardo, do you think this is a moment in which real democracy in Venezuela is possible? And more than that, do you think it's likely? How likely do you think that is?
Well, I think it was, first of all, thank you for organizing this event and for putting Venezuela on the agenda. I also want to, first of all, express my happiness with the fact that President Maduro, the dictator Maduro, is in jail, and the news that we have an important set of political prisoners that have just been freed. What is this?
You're in high demand.
Yeah, but I can't seem to 1 second. Where the hell is this? Here. So there we are. Am I back? Yeah.
You're back. Yes.
Yeah. So now the present is a very confusing moment. No one, I don't think if somebody had written this script for Hollywood, they would have said, no, it's not credible. there's kind of like an alliance between the Trump administration and the Chavista regime in Venezuela, and that's the governance structure, and that the Chavista regime is being supportive of the things that Trump is demanding from them. That obviously is the current state of affairs as of today, but no one thinks it's a sustainable state of affairs. So the question is, how is this situation today going to change? Because right now, Freddy cannot go back. I cannot go back. And if I cannot even go back, how am I going to, plan and do and think and create? So Venezuelans have not been empowered. You have the colectivos in the streets. You have Diosdado Cabello as the head of police. You have Vladimir Padrino Lopez as the head of the armed forces. You have the same Chavista structure in possession of all the government. The new Minister of Economy is the former president of the central bank, who presided over the largest hyperinflation the world has probably known in its whole history. It competes there with something that may have happened in Germany in the 1920s. So the government in Venezuela is the same Chavista government we saw before. Maduro has left. And then there's a lot of announcements and things that are said. And I'm particularly confused at the difference in tone between the things that President Trump says and the things that Marco Rubio says. So I'm having trouble trying to imagine what is the plan they have in mind. But they've been quite consistent saying, first, we want to avoid chaos. So maybe, the optimists are saying, let's have this government, unravel itself. Let's have the Chavistas unravel Chavismo. And, it's an interesting strategy. Nobody would have, again, if somebody had written it for Hollywood, they would have said, no, it won't fly because it's hard to believe. But that's the current strategy. And then they say, especially Trump says, oil, we have to recover oil, U.S. companies, the oil is ours, etc. Am I back? 1 second.
You're back.
Yeah.
You're speaking about the oil.
Yeah. The idea that we are first going to recover the economy, we're going to recover the oil sector, and then we can talk about democracy. But that's for later on. I think that strategy is not only, you may like it politically or not politically. I dislike it politically. It's not in my interest because I don't feel that I'll be empowered until for quite a long time. I don't feel that I can go and plan and do things because I have no rights, right? But more importantly, I think it's not feasible to do it that way, because in today's hydrocarbon law, all production has to be done by PDVSA, the national oil company. PDVSA is broke and it's being sued by everybody and his brother. You can do joint ventures with PDVSA, but it has to be 51% state ownership. And the tax take is just gigantic. So most projects are just not financially feasible. So no one would put money into that regime as it is. But then who's going to change the hydrocarbons law? This is a National Assembly that nobody recognizes, that nobody respects. Are they going to change the hydrocarbons law under the barrel of the gun? No one will think that hydrocarbons law is going to be respected by a future democratically elected National Assembly. In addition, the PDVSA is broke, sued. So even if you did business with, the cash flow can be seized by foreign creditors and so on. The country as a whole, the state of Venezuela is broke. It's in default on its debts. It has an exchange rate at 370 and another exchange rate at 770. So at what exchange rate do you bring money in? At what exchange rate do you take money out? It's just not investable. If you want Venezuela to become investable, you have to get back to first of all, a set of rules, a set of laws, a set of empowerments, and a macroeconomic stability, you have to restructure the debt. You have to go to the IMF. You have to borrow money from the IMF, from the World Bank. Who is going to? Every borrowing is a loan that has to be signed by a National Assembly, which is a credible National Assembly that can do those things. So I want to emphasize that the urgency to go back to democratic rule, to constitutional rule, is a prerequisite for economic recovery. It's not something that happens after economic recovery. And, I have a vested interest because I want to see democracy sooner rather than later, but I don't think that the plan is feasible because you cannot recover without democracy.
Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. Rebecca, I want to take us back to the very recent past and the very near term, what's to come. And you're obviously someone who knows the region, but who also knows the U.S. military and the Venezuelan military for that matter. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you made of the U.S. military operation that has been described, of course, as purely a law enforcement operation with a military component to remove Maduro from power. And what you make of this looming threat of a so-called second wave of military operations should the Trump administration not get what they want from a Delcy Rodriguez-led government, leaving aside the question for now of legality or propriety. Is that a viable tool? Is a second wave a viable option for the U.S. military?
Thanks, Ned. Thank you so much for having me. And it's such an honor to be on this panel with Freddy, with Ricardo, and with Juan. And I just want to say, Ricardo, your last statement about the idea that the rule of law is essential for any sort of economic stability or economic recovery is so important. But as far as the military goes, I mean, I would characterize the U.S., the operation itself that removed Maduro as a very sophisticated, well-organized, well-planned mission. For sure. It was a great example of layering human intelligence with signals intelligence. This was the fort, Tiuna, is actually in Caracas. It's a huge fort. And the fact that happened, that there was a total surprise, I think is a reflection of the success of that particular mission. That being said, I think that it's important to differentiate that military activity from what a second wave, for example, might look like. I think that if we are going to think about a second wave with U.S. boots on the ground, I think that's a very different scenario. And I think that is not something that the Trump administration wants. I think, if you look at the national security strategy, the new national security strategy, there's actually an emphasis on kind of ending forever wars. And I think that we all know, given the situation within Venezuela with the competing armed groups, dissident FARC, the ELN, the transnational criminal organizations, that it could lead to a very prolonged conflict with prolonged time with U.S. troops on the ground. About the military, though, the Venezuelan military, I think one takeaway from in addition to the fact that the operation that removed Maduro was very well planned, I think it also, though, shows that the Venezuelan military is a military that's optimized for internal control, more so than fighting an external force like the United States. And as Ricardo mentioned, elements of what we have now is Madurismo sin Maduro, right? Maduro's gone, but you have key players from his regime still there. The Delcy Rodriguez, the president, the Estado Cabello, who's we've seen the continued repression by the colectivos and militias. But I also want to mention that the defense minister, who's also in the indictment, along with Cabello, is there, Vladimir Padrino Lopez. So he is still there in Venezuela. So, and then the last thing I'll mention from the military perspective is I think that another takeaway from the operation itself is the fact that 32 Cubans died in that shows kind of the role of the Cubans, particularly in quelling internal dissent and making sure that members of the military stayed loyal to Maduro. It's the kind of the classic authoritarian alliance where you have one power that is providing support to the other power, like in this case, intel support, whereas the other power, Venezuela, is providing assets, oil to Cuba. But the goal of both, of course, is to maintain power.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. We'll come back to some of those topics as well. Juan, let me finish up this round of questioning with you, noting that you, of course, spent countless hours working on the challenge posed by the Maduro regime over the years. And so I'm curious if, in your estimation, there was any other viable path to seeing Maduro cede power. And in your mind, was Maduro's ouster in this particular way the right move at this time?
Well, thanks, Ned, and to the Harvard community and to my fellow panelists. Look, the short answer is yes. There were other paths toward Maduro's departure. Understandably, they were slower, less dramatic, and more conditional. I think whether Trump's approach was the right one really depends entirely on what outcome you care about and whether it can be fundamentally sustained. I think under Biden, the strategy was negotiated pressure, right? And there's been a lot of criticism of the Barbados agreement that we signed in October, but without that agreement, you do not have Edmundo Gonzalez. So it created a democratic moment, though Maduro did not allow an election where he ultimately did not control the outcome. And we expressed clear skepticism that he would do so from the beginning. But the premise really was for us that Maduro would not leave because of sanctions alone, but that the regime was vulnerable to calibrated incentives. So the goal for us was not regime change by force, but to create basically an internal political opening that Venezuelans could own. And it really allowed Maria Corina Machado, who I got to applaud that everything she's gone through, obviously incredible courage that she's had, and the exposure to potential violence is something that she needs to be admired and applauded for her courage. But the sanctions relief at the same time was conditioned on those concrete steps: the electoral guarantees, political prisoners. We were happy to secure the release of Freddy in October of 2023 and several others. Those were vital signals that we wanted out of the negotiations, but also internal observation and then respect for the results, which ultimately we did not get. It did not force Maduro out, but it produced something, I think, meaningful: unified opposition, a credible candidate, an election that Maduro lost but refused to honor, and ultimately he ended up marginalized and alienated. If you see the commentary in the region from countries across the political spectrum, from the left, center, and right, came out in criticism and exposed Maduro for what he was. And it also exposed the limits of what our negotiation can accomplish. But it also built legitimacy and international alignment. And fundamentally, based on the history of negotiations around the world, is fundamentally the sustainable approach to democratic transitions. I think the Trump approach is obviously much more coercive. He prioritized speed, dominance, control, and removing Maduro outright and asserting basically U.S. ownership over what followed, particularly, as Dr. Hausmann has mentioned, the oil. And that reflects, I think, a worldview that has been championed by Secretary Rubio, which is that Latin America responds not to incentives but to force, and that U.S. primacy must be basically reasserted without any sort of apology. And I think, look, there's a chance ultimately that Rubio pulls this off. I think there's a very low chance, but I think he could pull this off, where he laid out this phased approach, which was first control the chaos, economic stability, and then a transition. It's possible that happens. And it would represent, frankly, a genuine paradigm shift in how U.S.-Latin America relations would work. But the risk is enormous. And I think by declaring that the United States will quote unquote, run Venezuela, the administration has made everything that follows. Sorry, I just got a phone call while we were on the call. By declaring that the United States will run Venezuela, the administration has made everything that follows basically a political albatross. So, I think Maduro is gone, but the system very much remains. repression is rising, though I got to celebrate the release that we've heard recently of political prisoners. The legitimacy is absent. There's still very much a criminal structure in place, and the stability is basically being improvised. I think the ultimate judgment will run not on how Maduro left, though I think it's a bipartisan issue that Maduro was a bad person and he needed to leave, but on whether this approach dismantles the regime that he built or merely manages it from the outside. The danger is because Delcy Rodriguez is somebody who is a very effective manager. If this sort of marriage of convenience between the Trump administration, its interest for oil, and Delcy Rodriguez's ability to actually manage the Chavista infrastructure inside the country, you could end up in a scenario a year from now where the recovery, the stability, and the access to oil is something that satisfies what the Trump administration wants, specifically Donald Trump, and that the transition and the push for democratic for elections becomes an afterthought. And at that point, I think, associate myself with everything that Freddy and Dr. Hausmann and Rebecca had mentioned, which is that would be completely incomplete and ultimately would undermine U.S. interests, and it would make our policy in the hemisphere much less about really promoting freedom and democratic values and a lot more about really transaction and a very kind of, I think, very cold and calculating advancement of U.S. national security interests, that advance U.S. interests without really working in concert with the region, seeing the region as countries really have agency and that really should determine their own future. Thanks.
Juan, thanks for that. Just a reminder that we'll turn to Q&A from the audience in just a moment. So please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A box, and please feel free to identify yourself so that we can identify you when we turn to your question. I want to pose a couple of questions that any and all of you should feel free to jump in on. I want to start where Juan was going there. We've talked about the tactics. We've talked about what the future might hold for Venezuela, but I think in order to really offer up an assessment of that, we need a good understanding of the Trump administration's goals, what their priorities are and what their priorities aren't. I've seen it reported that the Trump administration wants drug smuggling to stop. They want U.S. adversaries out. They want U.S. oil companies in. And so for our four panelists, I'm curious, does that really constitute the entirety of the goals of the Trump administration? And if so, what does that mean for the aspirations of a democratic government to emerge from this Chavista shell that we still have in Venezuela today?
I do believe that, first, that it's not just about oil. I think there's also migration. I think there's also about national security and the participation of Iran, China, Russia, and Cuba in these affairs. However, I also believe that many people in the administration also understand the importance of having democracy, at least in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And I think that the freedom and democracy in Venezuela doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be something that it's confronted with American interest. Because, for example, to achieve the development as the oil industry, as Ricardo said, we will require rule of law and stability. If you want Venezuelans to go back to Venezuela and get out of the United States, we need safety and democracy there. If you want to get Russia, China, Iran out of Venezuela, that will help us also to get a stability in our country. So I think that, and that's kind of like the fine line that we have to play now, being in the democratic forces, to align both Venezuelan interests and American interests.
Yeah, I think the part of the problem with the policy of the announced policies of the Trump administration is that they're putting oil too much at the beginning of the process, when the whole oil thing is going to take a long time. And it's not going to be significant. If they are super successful, they may increase oil production by 200,000 barrels in the next year or so. That would be sort of like a good result. The U.S. produces 14 million barrels of oil a day and something like 22 million barrels of oil equivalent in natural gas. So this is, Venezuela is 1% of world production. So 200,000 barrels is 0.2% of world production. It doesn't change anything for American national security, national interest, but it would poison the well of oil policy going forward in Venezuela for decades if this is a set of concessions and stuff that are done under duress with privilege to US companies rather than a new market-based regime where everybody gets treated equally and where firms compete for the privilege of extracting Venezuelan oil. And that the proceeds go to Venezuelans because, as the Constitution says, we are the owners of the resource, right? There can be companies that extract the resource, but they don't own the resource, right? So they've never owned the resource. So it's important because I think that there's going to be a much broader international coalition if the agenda for Venezuela is about rights and democracy. But if the agenda for Venezuela is about US oil interests, there is no international support for that. So if we want Venezuela to re-enter the community of nations, we really want an agenda that is focused on things that are economically efficient and politically supportable. And I think it's not economically efficient to postpone rights and democracy, and it's not politically supportable to put oil at the top of the agenda.
Ned, can I just add something really quickly to that? And I think that it's one thing that's interesting is your question is kind of, it's like the $1 million question, right? What is the ultimate goal of the Trump administration? Because at first we heard drugs, you know, when there was, since September 2nd, when the first vessel was destroyed, you know, for a while there, we were hearing that this was really about counter narcotics and fentanyl, but of course the fentanyl that comes into the US is not coming from Venezuela, and the cocaine that's coming from, like, very little of the cocaine that's from Colombia comes through Venezuela. I think it's under 10%. So, you know, narcotics doesn't seem like that really is the driving factor. Then we heard more about regime change. And then finally, you know, it wasn't really until the seizure of the Skipper tanker that oil started to, you know, figure in so loudly or so explicitly in the administration's comments. But I do think that this, again, like, if the goal is regime change, we haven't yet seen this. We haven't seen the end of you know, Chavismo, of kind of the Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez. Again, I just, you know, Juan, you made a great point about, you know, her being the reputation for being a great administrator, but she also, just 2 points, is if the goal is to get external actors out of the region, particularly Russia and China. I mean, Delcy Rodriguez was, you know, one of the really kind of pushed forward those relationships between Venezuela and China and Venezuela and Russia, and also kind of her culpability when it comes to the, you know, gross violations of human rights that we heard about. So regime change, we haven't seen yet. And it's my hope, you know, Juan, what you mentioned about is it possible to have, you know, this different ordering of things? Because I really hope that that there is a plan for a transition to democracy. I hope that that is something that is a priority for the administration.
Great. Let me turn to a question that was also posed by someone in our audience. Dr. Michael Miner from the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School asked about some of the regional implications of this, and in particular, given the close relationship between the Maduro regime and Cuba, what this means for political stability in Cuba now and in the near future. So I will open that to you, Juan, if you want to start.
Yeah, thanks. So first, I mean, just to briefly kind of follow on what others were saying about the previous question, I'm going to just call a spade a spade. I think the priorities of Donald Trump are going to be not democracy promotion per se. It's going to be whatever benefits Donald Trump. I mean, and that's in the penchant to engage with autocratic rulers in other parts of the world, and the penchant for self-dealing by this administration, I think, is very concerning. So I think the I think the narrative and the pressure as the debate on Venezuela takes place should continue to highlight, I think, what Freddy laid out very much at the beginning, that and what Dr. Hausmann mentioned, which is if you want stability in the long term, you're going to need to have a democratic dividend coming out of this process. Otherwise, we're going to get distracted into the conversation about oil and gas and what benefit will come to the United States. So I think that really has to matter in the debate over Venezuela. When it comes to the international reaction, I think obviously first it's been very divided among left and right governments. The governments of the left have come out very critical of what's happening. A lot of countries of the right have been very relatively silent, even though they've celebrated the departure of Maduro. I think when you look at Europeans, they've all applauded the departure of Maduro, but they've reserved judgment on on the means that this administration has taken to wait and see what ends up happening. I think with the exception of Manuel Macron, who actually came out in support of Maria Corina Machado and the need to actually put Edmundo González, the rightfully elected president, in office. Now, when it comes to Cuba, I think a lot of this will depend. I think the goal of this administration, I think their general theory of change is that you impose so much pressure that it will lead to regime change. And that hasn't worked in Cuba for a very long time, but I think we're very much at a turning point. And the question will be less of a function of Venezuela and more of a function of what Mexico does, frankly, because right now Mexico has become the main supplier of oil and gas to Cuba. And the question I have is as the United States and Mexico enter into the USMCA negotiations, they technically don't start till this summer, but they're already ongoing, whether Mexico will prioritize its economic relationship with the United States over its historic relationship with Cuba. Even then, though, I mean, I've been wrong. I thought that a special forces operation was not viable given the high denial environment inside of Caracas. But the history with the Cubans and their approach is when you're on the back foot, you crack down, and then you just basically hold your ground and wait out the next administration. I think they're going to try to do that, and I think the leading indicator is going to be the humanitarian situation in the country, which is already dire. But I think as the Florida Straits, the current of the Florida Straits becomes calmer in March and April, we may start seeing people get on boats, even though the wet foot, dry foot policy is no longer in place. Those that can't afford to buy plane tickets to leave the country may be getting on boats. And I question if that is actually going to be politically palatable for this administration. I question whether there will be an appetite to again use military action in the country. I think a lot of those, are open-ended questions, but this administration has maintained the presence of roughly 13% of the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean, and you don't do that unless you plan on using it. So I think there's a possibility that they take action on Cuba, potentially encircling it and imposing an embargo, not letting resources in or anybody out of the country. I also think potentially, as Rebecca alluded to, it's not necessarily that they're going to do another operation inside of Venezuela, but yeah, I don't know if you saw, there was a press event recently with Diosdado Cabello where he was looking visibly nervous. And so I think he's one of the people that could potentially be, extracted from the country as well, especially if he's trying to undermine this relationship that's been built between the United States and marriage of convenience between the United States and Delcy Rodriguez in this instance. I doubt, however, I will say that I doubt that the region is going to be able to coalesce around a position on this issue. And that has been, I think, a problem for a very long time, because I think back in 2013, when Hugo Chavez died and Maduro came in, that was the time for the region to come together and put a lot of pressure and avoid this. But the tendency in Latin America and the Caribbean, I hate to say, is one of avoiding the problem until it gets really, really bad. And I think at this point, it's a little too late for there to be some sort of action. And unfortunately, sometimes Latin America and the Caribbean will only work in unison with the United States as a superstructure. And that's not really the priority of this administration at this moment. Thanks.
Freddy, do you want to come in on the question of Cuba?
I am trying to be not biased and very moderate, but I have to say, I will do my best that after we achieve freedom, the next one is Cuba, really, because they are the ones that really started this thing in Venezuela. I don't know if people know, but Venezuela was invaded by Cuba once in the 80s, if I remember right, Ricardo. I think it was in the 80s. In the 60s. Cuba, with Fidel Castro, tried to invade Venezuela. And very much of what is happening now is because the Cubans have been trying to control oil since many decades ago. And people could say, like, why is that? Why do you? Well, the proof is that the Cuban regime just recognized that 32 people were died in the military operation, and they were taking care of Maduro. For years, we've been saying that this wasn't just Venezuela. And a lot of people were saying, like, the same thing that they say now with drugs. We're saying that Venezuela was supporting terrorism, that Venezuela was supporting narco traffic, and that Venezuela was a playfield for Cubans, Iranians, Chinese, and Russian. And a lot of people would say, like, this is just lies and exaggerations because you want the Americans to do the job for you. Well, I think now we're seeing the proof. And I will have to say that this hemisphere will not be safe until also the Cubans are free and the Nicaraguans are free too.
I want to stay on this. Go ahead, Ricardo. Sorry.
I just wanted to say that the U.S. always prided itself that it helped, for example, free Europe, and it didn't take over territory, didn't take over wealth, etc. They won the war and they left, and when things were not working out, they went back with a Marshall Plan to help them out. So part of what makes the U.S. an attractive ally is the idea that it has this tremendous force. It's like Superman, but it's a force that is deployed for moral purposes. It's very important that the moral case be strong, because it's the moral case that helps create coalitions and helps create political support even in the country. I wish freedom for the Cubans. My wife was born in Cuba. Her side of the family is deep Cuban roots, and for them, communism has been a tragedy. Then we had to live through it 25 years in Venezuela. Cubans cannot free themselves in the same way that we could not free ourselves, and in the same way that my mother in Belgium couldn't free herself during the Second World War without American GIs. But the American GIs were perceived as a force, as a force with moral anchors, with a moral compass, and that moral compass has to be expressed more clearly, and it should bind action. This cannot be as Stephen Miller said, that this is a world of power and it's always been a world of power and the powerful get whatever they want. No, the powerful are powerful because they are respected, not feared, because they are seen as expressing a set of shared values that people can support.
I am very glad you came in with that intervention, because it is directly, it's a great seg and in some ways responsive to a good question we have from one of our students. Eva Rankin, who's a senior at Harvard College, asks, and maybe Rebecca, I'll turn to you to answer this first, if you're comfortable. For decades, the U.S. military has developed relationships with partner countries in Southcom through joint training and humanitarian relief. How might recent events impact the way countries view the U.S. military's presence there? And somewhat relatedly, how might recent events impact U.S. soft power in the region? Rebecca, I think you're muted.
That's a really important question. I think Juan's point about the polarization of the region is really important, because I think that there are some governments in the region, including that we work with militarily, that have really embraced this. I mean, it's not surprising. It's Noboa, Peña, Milei, Bukele, for example. And I think it's also important to note that one of the greatest challenges, I think, facing our hemisphere right now is crime and violence, citizen insecurity. And so many countries now are really turning to the U.S. for support in combating transnational criminal network. And that support is something that they really need. That being said, I think that one of the I'll tell you from my time in the Pentagon, trust deficits that were still lingering from decades when working with other militaries of the region. I think some of the greatest traction, and actually I believe she's a student. If she is a student, she's a very bright student, said about, cooperation on things like humanitarian assistance, disaster response, things like professional military training, defense institution building, these other forms of U.S. Defense Department, Department of War assistance are really have become kind of the base of these long-term relationships. And I think if we lose sight of that and it becomes, we shape our relationships based on this kind of what we're seeing now, I think that could really undermine the relationships that we've built so painstakingly over the last decade. So I very much hope that the Department of Defense, Department of War keeps that in mind in their most of it, Juan alluded to this too, most of our engagement is now in a bilateral relationship rather than working through hemispheric institutions, but that in our bilateral relationships we're working to kind of we're continuing to nurture those relationships, the people to people, building trust, and because I think otherwise this could have a really detrimental effect on our defense cooperation.
I want to ask another question from one of our students, Kate, who's a sophomore from Harvard College who studied biology. She's asking about the historical precedents for this, and she has read articles comparing the U.S. intervention in Venezuela to what happened in Panama. And she asks, what will it take for the U.S. to establish stability, whether economic or political, and prevent a power vacuum? And we've talked about some of that with the retention of the shell of the Maduro regime. But are there lessons we can learn from Panama, or should they be treated as two distinct cases? Any lessons we can derive from the 1989 experience?
Maybe I'll come in. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I'll be brief. So they're very different experiences. I mean, the United States used a law enforcement authority to go in. I think that's where the similarities, frankly, end, because the United States already had a military presence on the ground. We had a military base. I don't remember the number of troops. I think we had over 20,000 troops, and we stayed in the country until there were elections. That's something that this administration, as Dr. Bill Chavez mentioned, does not want to do. They don't want to be defending boots on the ground during a midterm election. I think it's pretty clear. I think the other dynamic that's very different is that, look, the civilian military pact that has existed under Chavismo in an environment where it fragments, you end up having multiple armed actors that are going to potentially be vying for control. You have the military factions, the intelligence services, you have pro-government militias that we've already seen driving around, intimidating people. And you have criminal groups that are embedded in the states. Not only that, but you have the National Liberation Army to the west, though there are reports that some of them are leaving Venezuela. And then you have a lot of these non-state actors inside of Colombia that have 50 years of experience in jungle and urban asymmetric warfare that could potentially go into Venezuela as oil companies are potentially going into the country. So this is something where I unfortunately think that, that this is something that right now the situation is relatively stable, meaning institutionally. Everybody's celebrating the departure of Maduro, rightly so. But as this goes on, it'll be very difficult, I think, for Delcy Rodriguez to balance keeping the U.S. happy while maintaining her coalition, and these colectivos that they don't totally control are going to make things complicated. And I think the question is, how much is the U.S. really willing to invest in the stability of Venezuela? Because I think ultimately going toward an election may actually require a U.S. military presence inside the country, much like it did in Panama.
I would just like to say that, oh, sorry, Ricardo, you were on the line.
No, go ahead.
No, that each country is different, of course. I think that we can take lessons from everything, but maybe this is a little bit out of line. But, I think that for me, it's sometimes interesting that we can say that Panama is different than Venezuela, but we, compare Venezuela with Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan. So, of course, each country is different. And I agree that the history in Panama and the challenges in Panama are different than the challenges in Venezuela. But I just want to say that it's very important that in the debate we cannot, we don't do cherry picking when we want to compare countries and others.
Yeah, I want to say one similarity between Panama and Venezuela, and that's that in May '89 there was an election that was won by President Guillermo Endara. and Noriega annulled that election. And the invasion happened in December 89. And the first thing that the US did is that they empowered the winner of the election. So that's how Guillermo Endara ended up in the presidency. It's because he had previously won an election. So that is a similarity. There was a guy now who has previously won an election, right? The problem is that if you want to look at some metaphor, if you want, Chavismo is like Hezbollah in power. It is a political movement that has an armed faction that is separate from the armed forces, or that controls part of the armed forces. And the problem that we're facing is how to disarm Chavismo as a military force so that we can keep an armed force under the control of the state, under control of civilian authority, and no political movement with arms. That is the challenge we face now. And right now, the heads of those Chavista arms are still in the government. And that's why we don't feel safe.
So it is striking to me that we've spoken about a post-Maduro Venezuela for nearly an hour, and we have barely mentioned two people, Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez. I think you just mentioned him for the first time, Ricardo. Ricardo, one of your former students, Geraldine Arias, a recent HKS graduate, asks, why would Maria Corina Machado publicly support the Trump administration's military intervention in Venezuela? No matter how much she wants Maduro out, it throws out international law and acknowledgement that democratic change needs to come from the inside out the window. Can you share some elements? If anyone wants to chime in on maybe the bind that in which Maria Corina Machado finds herself now.
Well, I think Freddy sort of answered that question. International law has been effective in protecting dictators. It has not been effective in protecting democracies. And, we have had all the diplomatic support, 60 governments plus, for Juan Guaido in 2019, for Edmundo Gonzalez in 2024. There is a broad international coalition, but it's not enough to unseat a dictatorship. And I honestly think that there was a principle in the OAS, that the Organization of American States, it was called the Collective Defense of Democracy, and the Democratic Charter that Latin American countries, countries in the Western Hemisphere agreed to abide by, but we have not been able to enforce that agreement. So when all of these things fail, let us Venezuelans be happy that there was an alternative to the failed implementation of international law for the protection of us, and that there was an alternative enforcement to kick out the dictator. But the question is, going forward, what needs to happen? And by the way, Trump said that Maria Corina Machado has no respect or support in Venezuela. I just want to say that I don't know. I know many people across the world. I don't know if I know anybody more respected than Maria Corina Machado. To say that Maria Corina Machado has a respect deficit makes no sense to me. And to say that that's the reason why they prefer Delcy Rodriguez, because she has a respect surplus, I have trouble with that argument.
Ned, can I add just something?
Please.
That sometimes I feel like with this discussion about the international order, it's kind of the same discussion, or not same, but it's a similar discussion with democratic backsliding. It's like sometimes when societies elect authoritarian leaders, there's a tendency to say or try to defend the old status quo, like if the old status quo was okay, And if the old status quo was okay, why people elected authoritarian leaders? So I think this is a kind of a similar discussion. It's like, are we going to really defend the international order that failed people in Gaza, people in Ukraine, people in Myanmar, people in Belarus, people in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba? Is this the discussion? I think we have to acknowledge that the world is failing to the oppressed people, and that maybe the United Nations just have to be, something to prevent world wars, but maybe it's time that the global democracies actually create a space to actually act together. Because as long as we have institutions like the United Nations in which China and Russia can veto anything, this thing will not work. So I think my invitation is to, I'm not saying that don't review what happened. That's good. That all critics are good. But let's think about the future and how do we make an international order that protects the oppressed and not just the oppressors.
Well, let me pose a follow-on question to that. Senia Smith, who is a junior at the college, noted Ricardo's statement that international law often protects authoritarian leaders. And Senia asked if we think that this tactic of getting rid of Maduro, as Senia writes, will have broader implications for how authoritarian leaders are dealt with on the global stage. Whether this means a broader reconsideration of when and how intervention should happen, and whether that implies changes to how we think about international law and sovereignty on a broader scale beyond Venezuela. And if I could just tack on, the president has articulated, or at least restated, what he calls the Don Roe Doctrine. And I'm curious what this group thinks that means for the certainly U.S. involvement in the region.
Well, look, I mean, I'll be brief, and then obviously invite others who've actually studied this as academics as well. Look, if I'm to derive a lesson from the Trump administration, particularly in the second term, is that the United States has a history of being a ruthless international actor to advance its own interests, right? And I think that this administration is taking it exponentially in a very negative direction that takes away agency from the Americas. It really basically says that the U.S. will unilaterally decide, and that the countries of Latin America are bystanders in this sort of doctrine. But I'd be careful to ascribe any sort of doctrine or strategy to what this administration is doing, which has been, I think, very much tactically focused on kind of political interests, frankly. I think or resource interests by the administration. But I think the risk here is that moving in a direction where the relationship with the Americas is so transactional, I think will undermine the ability of the United States to tackle much broader issues. I also think in a Democratic administration after this, or regardless of who wins, that's U.S. credibility in the region, but fundamentally in the world, is gonna be impacted, I think, permanently. Because why would another country trust what another administration would propose if they knew that in 4 years that approach would change consistently? So as the U.S. as the actor who helped build these international institutions, but then often acted individually as exercising U.S. exceptionalism, I think breaking this down ultimately puts us in a world where we're returning to kind of a spheres of influence approach, where we're carving up regions based on large countries and small countries. And I think ultimately that doesn't serve our interests, and all undermine our ability to mobilize collective action in the Americas and other parts of the world.
Can I just add one thing to that? I mean, if we look at the Western Hemisphere today, and some of the issues have come up, the most pressing challenges facing the hemisphere. Freddie, you mentioned migration. We've talked about transnational organized crime. The issues that are facing the region transcend borders. And by definition, I mean, I just cannot imagine, like, no single country, including the US, can address them on its own. So I think that one of the greatest challenges facing the Western Hemisphere is in this era of polarization within countries and among countries, is to find ways to work together. Because I mean, it's easier said than done. The Inter-American Democratic Charter, that was just such a beautiful moment for the inter-American system, and now we've seen it's really kind of lost its relevance. But I think one of the big tasks ahead of us is how do we strengthen regional cooperation? The solution to Venezuela ultimately is going to, it's in the hands of should be in the hands of Venezuelan people. Yes, the U.S. can play a role, but so should the rest of the countries of the region. I'll leave it there.
That is a very good place to end. I think somehow we have already exhausted a full hour, and there are about 36 additional questions from our students in our community that I wasn't able to get to. But we will save all of these questions. And as the situation in Venezuela continues to evolve, the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics, we're going to remain closely engaged in monitoring these developments and trying to foster what we hope to be an informed dialogue on all of these critical issues. We look forward to continuing this conversation, announcing additional programming related to Venezuela when all of our students are back on campus in the coming days. In the meantime, I want to once again thank all of our panelists, Ricardo, Freddy, Rebecca, Juan, for your interventions and for sharing your expertise. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. We look forward to much more to come, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.